Hi everyone, I'm Ashley at the Silver Bay Public Library, here again with Storytime. Today we have a few lovely books for you, and we are going to start off with The Fool and the Phoenix, A Tale of Old Japan. And if you guys remember, for our summer reading program, we are doing origami this week, and as I mentioned on Monday, origami comes from Japan, so I found this lovely book for us to read. It is by Deborah Norse Lattimore. Let us begin. Alright. Under the pear blossom moon, a poor birdcatcher named Hideo watched a hawk circling overhead. If he caught it, the villagers in the valley below would trade rice to own it. With a silent sweep of his net, Hideo caught the bird. He felt his own heart beat fiercely as the creature struggled in his grasp. No sooner had Hideo come to a clearing in the forest than did a bandit ride down upon him, knocking him into a shallow ditch. As Hideo stood up and brushed himself off, he caught a glimpse of the bandit's forehead. Over one eyebrow was a deep scar. For months there had been talk of a bandit in the mountains. A bandit who stole from the shogun himself. Hideo was grateful he had only been knocked down and not killed. Oh my. When Hideo arrived in the village, people came to look at the hawk. Then Nobu, head of the village council, appeared. "Where did you get that hawk?" he shouted at Hideo. "It has a silk cord around its leg." Hideo looked at Nobu, then pointed back towards the mountains. "Answer me, you," shouted Nobu. "He cannot speak, Lord Nobu," said the farmer. "He is the voiceless one from the mountains." "Ah," grunted Nobu, "a fool, a bad omen to have around." It was just yesterday that word came from the shogun's palace that a prize hunting hawk was missing, along with a treasure and some ponies too, said a farmer. Surely if word gets back to the shogun that this fool was seen here as a prize hawk, soldiers will come and burn our village to the ground. "Get out of here," shouted Nobu, shoving Hideo toward the road. Hideo stopped and looked hard at Nobu. He seemed familiar. "What are you looking at, you fool? Go on," yelled Nobu. "Never come back, or it will be your death." Oh my, he's very rude. Hideo trudged away from the village at the fork in the road near the forest. He released the brilliant black hawk. Perhaps there would be no rice to eat tonight, but the bird would be free. Alone and hungry, Hideo lay down beneath a spreading pine tree. The sweet sounds of the wind stirring the needles lulled Hideo to sleep. But all of a sudden, something stirred in the boughs. In an instant, Hideo threw his net. Something was in it. Something was in it! Hideo pulled and pulled. It twisted and wrestled against him. "Oh, please set me free," said a soft, trembling voice. "Let me go and I will reward you." He dropped the net. Gently and slowly he pushed aside the branches above his head. A dazzling golden light burst through the needles. The air was heavy and with the fragrance of cinnamon and incense. Hideo staggered back and stopped. In the midst of the light was a beautiful maiden. Her robe shimmered in silks of every color, over which lay a garment of golden feathers. Her strange and delicate face turned to Hideo and struck love in the birdcatcher's heart. For a while neither Hideo nor the maiden moved. At last, she spoke. "Very few mortals have ever seen me or my kind," said the maiden. "The last to come this way was a bandit, and he killed my husband. Since then I have waited here alone and afraid. You have spared me, and I owe you my life. What wish can I grant you, birdcatcher?" But Hideo could ask for nothing. He hung his head down in silence. The maiden seemed to read his thoughts. "No, you are right. I cannot restore your voice," said the maiden. "Stay with me but a while, and neither of us shall be lonely." She clapped her hands, and an evening meal spread upon golden plates lay at Hideo's feet. And as Hideo began to eat, the maiden sang soft, sweet songs. It seemed to Hideo to be the longest, most wondrous day of his life, and yet, without his realizing it, a whole month had passed. For him, there was no day or night, or loneliness or hunger. But the day came when noises entered the forest. Noises Hideo knew to be the shogun's men searching for something or someone. "The bandit," Hideo thought. "No one has found him. If he is not found soon and the shogun's treasure is not returned, the village will be burned to the ground." As the soldiers passed below on the forest path, Hideo slowly covered his mouth and tears fell from his eyes, and the maiden again read his thoughts. "This is the day you must leave me," said the maiden. "For although you and I love each other, only you can save the village. Find the bandit who killed my husband and who not only steals you from me, but who also steals the very life from the village. Then the maiden plucked a single golden feather from her gown and placed it in Hidio's cupped palm. Though it shone with fiery flames, it did not burn. When Hideo looked up, the maiden was gone. Hideo tied the feather to a thread and put it around his neck. Then he set off for the village. He stopped at the forest's edge. Something was wrong. Where was the sound of the rushing stream that filled the rice paddies in the valley? Walking on, Hideo saw that the stream bed was dry, blocked by a large log. Hideo pushed against the log with all his strength until it turned and twisted into the flowing water. In minutes the stream was full and fat and rushing downhill. There are many ways to steal the life from a village, he thought. The feather around his neck glowed. On Hideo walked toward the valley and the village below. He did not go far when he came upon more wood cuttings and logs. This time they were blocking a pond filled with fat red fish. Why, the village ponds must be empty of fish, he thought, and as before, Hideo pushed away the logs and branches, and as before, the feather glowed, but this time it was brighter. On Hideo walked, but soon his path was almost completely blocked. He had to climb over logs and branches scattered all around what seemed to be the opening of a cave. Leaning against a great stone outcropping, he looked closer. He could just make out the sounds of horses' whinnies. The stolen treasure, he thought. Through a small opening in the brush he saw that he was right. The glitter of gold and silken fabrics was everywhere, and just beyond casks filled with jewels stood a string of handsome horses and racing ponies, nervously pawing at the ground. Hideo ran. The feather on his neck glowed brighter and brighter, and by the time Hideo arrived in the village, the feather was nearly aflame. Angry farmers stood beside the dried rice paddies and empty fish ponds. Among them was Nobu, who turned and stared at Hideo. "Look!" a farmer shouted. "It is the fool!" And he shook his fist at Hideo. "Perhaps he is to blame for our misfortune. No water, no fish, and the shogun's men are coming too." But before Hideo could get anyone's attention, water rushed into the ponds and they were brimming with fish. The farmers jumped back in amazement, and then they all looked at Hideo. Nobu, too, looked at Hideo. He saw the brilliant flame of gold that the feather was. "What kind of sorcery is this?" he demanded, his face turning red with anger. But Hideo stared fixedly at the scar over one of Nobu's eyebrows. Suddenly he remembered where he had seen Nobu before. Nobu was the bandit. Nobu, wise leader of the council, the one who spoke for all, was a thief. "Get him!" yelled Nobu. "Kill him! The fool is the bandit. See, he wears part of the treasure around his neck." The crowd yelled and shoved. Some moved with Nobu. Hideo held the feather close. "How can I tell them?" he thought desperately without knowing why. Hideo turned and ran toward the forest. The farmers followed, and with them came Nobu. They passed the flowing fish pond. They followed the racing stream up higher and higher into the forest. They all went until they came to the spreading pine tree where Hideo had first found the beautiful maiden. Dozens of hands fell upon Hideo and held him tightly. Nobu stepped forward, a knife in his hand. The tree branches broke apart, and a stream of golden light flooded the sky. The beautiful maiden appeared. "Ah!" she cried, looking at Nobu. "That is the bandit. He is the one who killed my husband, the phoenix, the bird of prosperity. It was he who almost destroyed your village, too." The villagers set Hideo free and grabbed Nobu instead, who, in his shame, confessed what he had done. The villagers begged Hideo to return with them to live in the village and to serve on the council of the wise. For a moment Hideo thought he might, but when he remembered the joy he felt beneath the great pine tree, under the gentle gaze of the strange and beautiful maiden, Hideo decided to stay in the woods. No one in the valley ever saw Hideo again, but from that day on the village prospered. Many, many years after the treasure was returned to the shogun, the 9th lord of Owari, and the 10th followed him and his son and the son's son after him, a family walking on the forest path noticed a great spreading pine tree. Its magnificent boughs and rich green needles sheltered them from the afternoon sun, but suddenly it glowed as if it were burning with fire. The frightened family ran back, still watching. Within the golden flames they thought they saw 2 phoenixes, their wings entwined around each other. Then, with a burst of light, the fire burned out and only ash remained. As suddenly as the fire died, the 2 phoenixes flew up and out of the ashes, out over the tops of the trees, over the mountains of Owari, their golden wings beating as one. And that is the story of the Fool and the Phoenix, a tale of old Japan. I hope you enjoyed that. I thought it was quite appropriate. Next, we're going to switch up gears a good amount. And we're going to be reading The Bookseller Bird by Felicia Law and illustrated by Nicola Evans. I just thought these little guys were so cute. So I know it's going to be a bit of a different read than the previous book, but I think everyone will enjoy it. Yes. Bamboo, Velvet, and Beak sit on their log in the middle of the magical forest, just as they always do. Many puffins live near Iceland, which is this guy. Giant pandas are found on the mountains of China. Zebras live on the savannas of Africa, if you didn't know. There's just enough room for 3. Hello? May I sit down? Asks a bird with a heavy bag. Everyone tries to scoot over, but it's too crowded. Do you come here often? Asks the bird. Yes, we do, they reply. That's nice, says the bird. What else do you do? What do you mean? Asks Beak. Well, asks the bird, do you sing, play games, or tell stories? We mostly talk, says Bamboo. And think, says Velvet. And about very important things, adds Beak. That's interesting, says the bird. Do you talk about the heat of the sun, the size of the sun, and the weight of the world? Not really, says Bamboo doubtfully. Never, exclaims Velvet and Beak. Then I wonder if I could interest you in this set of big books, asks the bird. They may look very heavy, but I promise you they are full of important facts. There are so many words, says Velvet, turning the pages. But there are pictures, too, says the bird. Kind of like the book we're reading. Wow. Can we really learn all sorts of new things from these books? Asks Bamboo. Oh yes, says the bird. And when you are done reading the books, you can pile them here at the end of the log. Then there would be enough room for all of us to sit down and talk about what you read. They're just so adorable. And that's the end of The Bookseller Bird. And if you want to read some fun books like these animals, come to the library. We are open. The next book I'm going to read has nothing to do with the theme of the week or anything, but I thought this looked positively adorable. It is called Albert. It is by Donna Jo Napoli and illustrated by Jim LaMarche. And this one is called Albert. Alright. Albert sat at his table and drank tomato juice and listened to the noises of the morning. The people in the apartment above clattered downstairs and out the door on their way to work. The dog next door barked hello to everyone who passed. Children giggled on their way to school. These were good noises. Albert stood up and worked his hand out between the grill work over the window. He wanted to check the weather. The garbage truck rumbled by. That wasn't a good noise. Albert shook his head. Too cold, he said. He shut the window and rubbed his hands to warm them. Then he sat down and read the comic strip. The next day, Albert ate lunch and listened to the noises of midday. The mailman sang as he slung his pack over his shoulder. The snack vendor shouted out the day's special, golden bean cakes. The flower lady laughed with her customers. Good noises today. Very good noises. Albert went to the window and reached his hand toward the maple tree. How was the weather today? 2 men walked past arguing. Now that wasn't a good noise. Too damp. Albert shut the window and wiped his hands on his trousers. Then he took out a pack of cards and did card tricks. The next day, Albert said, too hot, and the next day, too breezy. Albert told himself that when the weather was just right, he'd put on his hat and go for a walk. And every day the weather seemed good at first, but after a moment more, it turned out the weather was never just right. So Albert listened to baseball games on the radio and cut pictures out of magazines and wrote postcards he never mailed. Then one sunny day, Albert stuck his hand out the window, and the next thing he knew, a twig appeared in it. Albert looked around in surprise. A cardinal flew by and dropped in another twig. And then there were two cardinals, a bright red male and a brown yellow female, and both of them were dropping twig after twig. Albert watched, dumbfounded, as his now cupped hand filled to the brim. The cardinals fluttered and fused and poked and pulled. They heaped grasses into the center of the twigs. Finally, the female shaped the nest to fit her breast and settled in. Albert stared at her. Excuse me, but my arm's not a branch. But the cardinal didn't even look at him. She flew off, leaving a nest of 4 tiny eggs in Albert's hand. With his free hand, Albert scratched his head. If he pulled his arm in, twisting to get back through the grillwork, the net would surely fall apart. So he stood there. The mother cardinal returned. Albert stood with his arm out the window. Miss Cardinal, I think you picked a poor spot to build a nest. But the cardinal just whistled and fell asleep. That night, Albert slept standing up. The next day, the mother cardinal kept the eggs warm while the father cardinal fed her. Albert rubbed his aching neck. Listen, I hate to disappoint you two, but I'm not sure this is going to work. The cardinals looked at Albert, then they preened each other. That night, Albert slept standing up again. The third day, Albert rotated his shoulders to get the kinks out. Ugh. The mother bird flew to the ground and pecked at a grub. Perfect sea blue ovals with red-brown spots. Oh, no. Albert took a good look at the eggs for the first time. Perfect sea blue ovals with red-brown spots. The father bird flew down and chattered at the mother bird. She flew back to the eggs and sat on them. Pretty eggs, said Albert gently. The cardinal gave a quizzical chirp. Day after day, Albert stood the nest in his hand. He began each day by watching the birds, then he looked around. Once the plane roared overhead. Albert's first urge was to pull his arm in and shut the window, but the nest kept him there. So he watched the plane till it went out of sight, and soon he found himself dreaming about the places those passengers were going to visit, and he smiled. Once a man and a woman came out of a building yelling. They turned their backs on each other and both walked off in a huff. Albert wanted so much to pull his arm in and shut the window, but the nest was there, so he stayed put. About an hour later, the man appeared from one direction and the woman appeared from the other. Each held a wrapped present. They laughed and hugged. Albert dreamed about what it might be in those presents, and he smiled again. Albert didn't only dream. Whenever the mother cardinal hopped off the nest even for a moment, Albert breathed his hot breath onto the eggs to warm them. And once when the mother cardinal was away, a cat walked along the edge beneath Albert's arm. It flicked its tail and looked up curiously. It crouched, ready to spring. Albert screeched. The cat ran off. Albert chuckled. A week passed, and one morning when Albert opened his mouth, he peeped. The father cardinal looked at him askance, but Albert peeped instantly. The cardinal flew off. He returned with a beetle. Albert wrinkled his nose and jerked his head away. The cardinal ate the beetle, then he flew off again. This time he returned with a blackberry. Albert ate it gratefully. From that day on, Albert peeped, and the father cardinal fed him blackberries, and Albert smiled at the noises all around him. Days passed. On the 12th morning, Albert spied a crack in one of the eggs. He put his face to the grillwork so he could see everything perfectly. The second egg cracked, and the third and the fourth. The baby birds pecked their way out, wet and scraggly. Good work, Albert smiled. Welcome. In the next few weeks, the mother and the father cardinals fed their brood, including Albert, who learned to love seeds and berries and even eventually beetles. Ugh. The mother sat on Albert's wrist and sang her joy. The father flew to the top of the maple and sang his pride. The parents whistled to the fledglings, encouraging them to test their wings. Soon the first fledgling left the nest, then the second and the third, but one stayed. He hopped up Albert's arm and pecked his nose. He looked worriedly at the ground. Go for it, birdie, said Albert. Fly. The fledgling looked down again. He kept his wings close to his body. Albert stuck out his hat in front of the fledgling. Come on, give it a try. The fledgling jumped into the hat. Albert tossed him up lightly. He fluttered a little and landed safely back in the hat with a peep. Albert tossed him higher. He fluttered a lot and landed back in the hat with a loud chirp. Albert tossed him high, high, high. The fledgling looked around and spread his wings. He flew to the maple tree and whistled. Albert smiled and whistled back. The nest sat empty in Albert's hand. He drew his arm in through the girl work and the nest fell. Albert looked at the grass and the trees and the sky. He listened to laughter nearby, a good noise, and the siren of an ambulance far off, a bad noise. And Albert knew somehow that both were part of this big wonderful world. He put his face up to the grill work and felt the wind and the sun on his cheeks. Just right, he said. Albert smoothed his hair and brushed off his hat. After so long he hardly looked himself, he went outside for a walk. Now, Albert walks often, and sometimes, just sometimes, when no one's looking, he flies. And that is the story of Albert and the cute little cardinals. I thought this one was just precious. But that is going to be all for us today. I know I only got through 3 books. Normally I get through a bit more, but some of these, like this one and the first one, were a bit longer, so I hope you enjoyed them. Make sure to keep watching. I do these Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I also do chapter book readings for more advanced readers or whoever wants to listen to them. Make sure to come stop in at the library, sign up for the summer reading program, and I hope you have a wonderful week. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.